When we finally got the door open, we found an old man lying on the floor in a pool of blood, horribly mauled. On his chest was a little music box, playing an odd, lilting melody. He opened and closed his mouth soundlessly when he saw us and tried to say something, but he couldn't get any words out. At that moment, the music box slowed and began to stop, and a look of abject terror appeared on his face. He fumbled with the music box and desperately tried to wind it, but the effort caused him to cough, and blood spewed out of his mouth. I ran to him and tried to help him clear the blood, but it was too late. He was dead. Then, coming from somewhere out there in the dark hills, we heard it again. A horrible shrieking, part human, part animal, part something else. But I better rewind a bit. It all started quite innocently. I was spending a year in Florence studying art at the Florence Academy. There were 3 other people in my classes who, like myself, loved hiking, and we tried to hike the mountains and trails of Italy as often as we could. Usually just for a couple of days here and there, since the classes took up most of our time. I'm English and the other 3 were all Americans. Americans are drawn to Florence by some kind of irresistible force, I think. Mike was very outgoing and rather eccentric, at least by European standards. He was always talking about homeopathy and crystals, and he'd taken up hiking to try to lose weight, although it didn't seem to be helping. Polly was a lot more reserved. She played the cello and she'd studied law at Harvard before deciding that law wasn't really her thing, and what she really wanted was to become an art historian. Then there was Cooper. When I first met him, I didn't like him. I thought he was arrogant and too slick by half, but his sense of humour reeled me in, and we became fairly good friends. His family was rich, and Renaissance art was just the latest in a long line of crazes for him. He'd previously been obsessed with skydiving, day trading, cave diving, French literature, and about 50 other things that I've forgotten. I think it was Polly who suggested exploring the Abruzzo. This is a relatively sparsely populated region of Italy, somewhat south of the centre, on the east coast. Among other things, it's known for its forests and mountains. Primo Levi famously described the people there as strong and kind. We settled on a route that would take us through a heavily forested area, from the Grotta dei Morti to the base of Monte Amaro. One fine morning in mid-September, our friend Richard dropped us off at the starting point. "Take some photos," he shouted over his shoulder as I shut the car door. Cooper inhaled deeply and dramatically through his nostrils. "Smells a bit different to Florence," he said. "It's beautiful," said Polly. Richard had put us down in a lovely old village of stone cottages surrounded by limestone hills, the rusty-coloured stone interspersed with patches of green. "The authentic air of Italy," pronounced Mike approvingly. "I'll wager the air alone could cure diseases just by itself." We headed straight out of the town, and after an unremarkable walk of about 2 miles by the side of a quiet road, we began to head steeply up a hillside. The path wound back and forth between briars and myrtles and fragrant herbs, finally levelling out about 400 metres up, by which time we were all soaked in sweat in the heat of the day. "It's not all going to be like this, is it?" asked Mike, a worried expression on his face. Mike had required at least 10 breaks just to get to that point, although I had been glad of the rest myself. "Not at all," said Cooper. "We're heading into a pass now. It's going to be mostly level." "We can stop for an early lunch in a bit, Mike," Polly suggested. "It's very hot, isn't it?" I said. Mike was actually dripping like a tap or faucet. September in those parts isn't as bad as August, but evidently there were plenty of hot days left in the summer. "Let's try to make a bit of progress at least," said Cooper. We marched on, drinking vast amounts of water, and stopped for a lunch of cheese, focaccia and sweet pastries after a couple of hours. The cheese had held up pretty well in the heat, I was pleased to find. At around 3 o'clock, the trail passed by some farmhouses, and it was there that the trouble began. "Are we sure this is the way?" said Polly doubtfully, thinking perhaps we'd strayed onto private property. "According to the map it is," I said. "What does that old dear want?" said Mike. He nodded at a wizened elderly lady who was standing outside a decrepit cottage watching us. She seemed to have sallied forth to await us, exactly like someone who felt their property rights were being violated. I double-checked the map, but it was quite clear that we had right of way. When we got closer, she unleashed a torrent of Italian on us. "Può parlare un po' lentamente, signora," I said hopefully, in halting, poorly pronounced Italian. "What's the old crone saying?" said Cooper. It was obvious from her gestures alone that she didn't want us going any further. I listened carefully, but I could understand only a little of it. "I think she's saying we shouldn't be out here after it gets dark," I said. "She says something about dangerous animals." To the woman I said, "Animali pericolosi," hoping I'd got the words right. At this she broke into a series of violent asseverations. Evidently I had identified the key take-home message. "Tell her we've got bear repellent spray," said Polly. "I've no idea how to say that," I said. "Let's keep moving," said Cooper, walking off. "Come on, keep up the pace." We followed him while the old woman waved her arms about angrily. "We're fine, thank you," said Mike loudly, with a smile. That was followed by more shouting from the woman. "Thank you, ma'am," said Mike, not understanding a word of it. When we had got far enough away that the woman couldn't really hope to make herself understood anymore, she abruptly began singing an old mournful song, as though giving an impromptu music lesson. "What the hell?" said Cooper dryly. She stood watching us for some time afterwards, singing to herself. Not until we had escaped her gaze by rounding the side of a rocky outcrop did we burst into laughter out of relief. "Geez, I thought she was going to attack us," said Mike. "I think you made her even more enraged," said Polly. "Well, I certainly didn't intend to," said Mike. "She had a definite surfeit of yellow bile." "What was she singing?" said Polly. "Haven't the foggiest," I said. We hiked on into a spectacular mountain pass, framed by tall granite cliffs and numerous pines, gradually ascending upwards. By about 5 o'clock, Mike was exhausted, and Polly and I felt we'd reached a good place to make camp anyway. Only Cooper seemed annoyed at not making more progress. "I kinda wanted to get over the top of the next hill today," he said. "You'd have to carry me," said Mike, so we stopped and started putting up the tent. We only had one tent, but it was big enough, and it only had to serve us for one night. It seemed too much of a fire risk to make a fire there. The hills were intensely dry, and everything looked as though it might easily go up in flames, so instead we contented ourselves with making soup on a little camping stove and dipping focaccia into it. "This is probably some sort of criminal offence in Italy," said Cooper. "If it tastes right, it is right," said Mike. "Pretty sure they dip bread in soup everywhere," said Polly. We passed the evening fairly pleasantly, chatting about this and that, marvelling at the landscape. When the sun went down, we felt ourselves to be completely alone under the stars in a vast wilderness. Although the wilderness was in reality tame enough to be reassuring, and we weren't so very far from civilization. The stars out there were spectacular, and we spent a while just gawping at them and trying to remember which star was which between the four of us. The Milky Way was easily visible as a vast white cloud, and shooting stars periodically streaked across it. It's easy to forget how far civilization cuts us off from the wonders of the night sky. We planned to get an early night, but none of us could face trying to sleep much before 10, accustomed as we all were to rising fairly late. It was around 9:30 when we first heard it. A curious animal sound, half growl, half shriek, coming from somewhere far away in the darkness. "What in the name of bejesus was that?" said Mike. "Did you guys hear that?" "Sounds like a sick parrot," said Cooper. "Must be some sort of bird," said Polly. "It's probably the old woman," said Cooper. "She probably howls at the moon as well." We heard the sound again a few minutes later, closer this time. "It's coming this way," I said. But the next shriek sounded a little farther off. For the next half an hour we listened as the shriek seemed to emerge from all parts of the valley, near and far. We weren't too worried, and we agreed it must be some kind of weird bird. Around 10 we decided to sleep, Cooper sniffing dubiously inside the tent as the other three of us tried to arrange ourselves in there, announced that he would spend the night outside. That seemed a reasonable idea, since the evening was warm enough, and I considered doing the same myself, but I thought it'd probably get colder towards the morning. It took me a long time to get to sleep, and I lay awake listening to Mike snoring and that weird shrieking. I had the distinct impression that the animal was circling in on us gradually, but neither a bear nor a wolf could have made that sound, and there was nothing else out there to worry about that I knew of. All the same, there's no denying that the combination of that weird noise and the old woman's dire warnings had rattled me a bit. Around 3 in the morning, I woke suddenly out of a deep sleep to the sound of a horrible scream. The sound had awoken the others also. "What in holy hell was that?" said Mike. "We'd better check on Cooper," said Polly. "I'll go," I said. I went outside and shone the torch at the spot where Cooper had been sleeping. Cooper wasn't there, but I thought I spotted something weird on his sleeping bag. I leaned in closer, and with a terrible start, I realized I was looking at a severed hand. I yelled and ran back into the tent in a panic. "It got Cooper," I shouted. "What got Cooper?" said Mike. "I don't know, but his hand is all that's left of him." "His hand?" said Polly faintly. "There's a severed hand on his sleeping bag and no sign of him," I explained. At that, they began frantically dressing. "We have to get out of here," said Polly. Soon we were all standing outside looking at Cooper's hand. Mike shone the torch nervously around. We were all in a state approaching shock. "What could have done this?" said Mike. "Let's just go," said Polly. "What about all the stuff?" I said. "Leave the stuff, geez," said Mike. "We'll get to a road and flag down a car." None of us had any phone signal, so phoning for help wasn't an option. We began to hurry on down the trail, scanning the dark woods around and behind us with the electric torches. We hadn't gone more than 100 yards when there was a shout behind us. We froze. It was Cooper. He came at us out of the gloom looking half dead, holding his bloody stump of an arm aloft to reduce the bleeding. He was pale as death. "It jumped on me out of nowhere," he gibbered frantically. "One moment I was asleep and the next it had my arm." "What was it?" said Polly. "Something hideous," said Cooper. "A monster." He began to cry pitifully. "Can you walk?" said Mike. Cooper nodded dumbly. "It's at least 3 miles to the road," said Polly. "He won't make it." "I can make it," screamed Cooper unhingedly. "We have to get to the road. It will kill us." We tied some elastic around Cooper's forearm to try to slow the bleeding. Then Mike and I tried to support him as best we could as we followed the path in the dark, with painful slowness. "Maybe we should stay and fight it," said Mike. "We've got hiking sticks. Hell, we could clobber it with a big stone even." "No," screamed Cooper. "You don't know what you're talking about. It's too strong. It's not normal." Whatever Cooper had seen, it had truly put the fear of God into him. Our prospects for getting to the road without Cooper passing out didn't seem great. Even with elastic tied around his arm, he was losing a lot of blood, and Mike and I were steadily getting covered in it. Even worse, we kept hearing that dreadful half shriek, half growl coming from somewhere behind us. It was as if it was taunting us, knowing it could take us any time it wanted and savouring our fear. Cooper soon started to shiver convulsively, and his feet began to drag on the ground. We were almost resigned to one or two of us having to wait there with Cooper and hope for the best while the others ran off to get help, when we saw some lights a little way off in the distance. "It must be a farmhouse," said Polly. "Who would have lights on at this time in the morning?" said Mike. "Maybe they do it to deter burglars," I suggested. "We'll have to hope someone's home anyway. Maybe they've got a phone." We switched course and began to make for the lights. As we got closer, we realised the light came from a rather ugly modern building, quite uncharacteristic of the area. It seemed to have somehow evaded planning permission laws, and had an ugly 3-storey concrete facade. Altogether, it looked more like some sort of factory than a farmhouse. On the way there we had a couple of close calls, when the unearthly shrieking seemed to suddenly arise from unusually close by, and we thought the thing was about to spring at us, but no attack came. When we reached the building, Polly pounded hard on the door. Even after 5 minutes of pounding we still hadn't got a reply, and Cooper was continuously shaking and was pale as death. In desperation, she tried the door handle and it actually opened. We dragged Cooper inside, not knowing what kind of a place we were entering, but feeling it was better than being eaten outside. After feeling around a bit, we located a light switch. The place we found ourselves in resembled some sort of security room, with a collection of old chairs facing dusty old monitors. None were switched on. "It might be some kind of high-tech wine-making place," said Mike. "They take their wine awful serious round here." "Let's just hope they have a phone," I said. Polly held up her hand. "Listen," she said. We listened, and we found we could hear a faint musical tinkling coming from somewhere in the back. "Someone's playing music," I said. "Maybe it's a piano," said Polly. We listened again. It didn't sound quite like a piano, nor anything else recognisable. "I'll go and look," I said. "I'll come with you," said Mike. We left Cooper slumped against the wall with Polly tending to him as best she could. "Try to find a first aid kit," she said as we left. We followed a dark corridor down towards the sound. There didn't seem to be any working light switches, and we had to use our torches. Whatever kind of facility the place had been, it had the feeling of being abandoned. Eventually we found the source of the tinkling. A door that was open just a crack. It sounded like someone was playing a little music box inside the room. We pushed the door, but it seemed to be wedged shut with something heavy on the other side. We began to try to push the door open, making gradual progress with shifting whatever was on the other side of it. Eventually, we'd opened it enough to be able to step through the gap. We found there was a working light in the room, and when we switched it on, we saw the heavily wounded old man with his little music box, the one I mentioned at the start. He died very quickly, before we could collect our thoughts. His appearance was so startling that we stood there more or less frozen for some moments while he wound his music box and then proceeded to die in front of us. Then we heard more shrieking from outside the dark window underneath which he was propped, half upright. A heavy desk had been pulled against the door to keep it shut, but the floor was covered with blood. "It looks like he dragged himself in here after something attacked him," said Mike. We both looked nervously through the dark glass of the window. Again we heard the shrieking. "The same thing that attacked Cooper, probably," I said. "Must have been playing the music box to attract attention," said Mike. That explanation seemed a bit off, but I hadn't got a better one. It sounded like the same melody the old woman was singing, I said. Must be some kind of local folk tune, said Mike, or maybe all the local music sounds similar. We need to try to find a phone, I said. Whatever attacked that guy must still be out there, said Mike. We need a weapon of some kind. I looked around for something heavy and found a fire extinguisher hooked to the wall. I'll take this, you take the torch, I said. If anything comes for us, I'll stove its head in. We went back to the corridor and followed it cautiously. There were a few locked rooms that we couldn't get into. At the end, the corridor terminated in steps that led up to the next floor. "We'd better check what's up there," said Mike. "At least the steps are going up and not down." The steps terminated in a wide landing with a steel and wire screen running right across it, separating the landing at the top of the stairs from the rest of the floor. An open door stood in the middle of the screen. We noticed traces of blood or dirt on the floor. There were dim red emergency lights, but the main light switches didn't work here either. "I'm not going in there," said Mike. "What if there's a phone in there?" I said, "or a first aid kit?" "Why would there be?" said Mike. "This looks like something inordinately weird." "Let's quickly check, then we'll go back down again," I suggested. Mike reluctantly agreed, and we stepped nervously through the open door. Inside, a grotesque and loathsome sight met our eyes. We found ourselves in a huge room, taking up most or all of the second floor, lined with cages. In the cages were a hideous assortment of creatures. All of them were dead or dying. Many were recognizable as dogs or pigs, but had horrible surgical wounds or nightmarish devices attached to them. Some were not recognizable at all and had hideously insectoid faces. Most disturbing of all given our situation, some of the cages seemed to have been partially forced open. "Let's get out of here," said Mike, "quickly." We returned to the landing and pulled the door shut behind us. It had a steel frame, but most of it was just black wire mesh, and the mesh was torn in places. "What kind of devilry is going on in here?" said Mike, badly shaken. "Some kind of experimental facility, clearly," I said. "Let's get back to the others. I'm done with exploring." As we were descending the stairs, we thought we heard a particularly loud and prolonged bout of shrieking coming from somewhere outside. We were glad to be inside, but the sight of the old man had set us wondering where exactly he was attacked. It was possible there was something loose in the building. When we finally got back to the security room at the entrance, a terrible nightmarish sight met our eyes. I hope never to see anything like that again, as long as I live. The remains of Polly and Cooper were strewn horribly around the floor, separated into numerous different parts. Mike was sick on the spot. "Oh dear God, no!" he moaned. I grabbed the torch and shone it all around the room, trying to see how whatever had attacked them had got in. Then I heard a scuffling in the corridor we had just left, and a hideously loud shriek. "Go!" I shouted. "Out the front!" We bolted through the front door and slammed it behind us. "Dear God!" exclaimed Mike again. We could hear that fearful shrieking all around us, coming from at least 3 different directions. I really thought we were done for. As for the deaths of Cooper and Polly, I just couldn't process it. I only wanted not to be torn apart myself. It was as if we had been plunged into a living nightmare, where nothing seemed completely real, and any horror was possible at any moment. "Come," I shouted at Mike, "come on." We began to run west towards where the road was supposed to be, but Mike, with his considerable weight, soon had to slow down to a walk. "Leave me," he said, gasping. "Save yourself." "We stick together," I said. I still had the fire extinguisher, It was heavy, but I felt it gave me a fighting chance if we were attacked. We half walked, half jogged as briskly as Mike could manage towards the road. All the while the shrieking circled us, almost as if the creatures were herding us to our doom. The terror of the next half hour or so will be burned in my mind forever. We had seen what those animals did to our friends. They had not only been killed, but literally torn into pieces. We knew the beasts were following us. We could hear them shrieking to each other. I desperately wanted Mike to go faster, but he already looked to be on the verge of a heart attack, and he was going as fast as he could. I couldn't abandon him. Every so often Mike had to stop clutching his chest, and he shone the torch wildly about in the darkness, looking for the dark forms of the beasts. Sometimes we thought we saw the vague outline of something scampering in the dark, but we could never be sure of it. After what felt like hours, we found ourselves at the top of a high scree leading down to a road. Boulders and loose rocks littered it all the way down for about 100 meters, interspersed with an occasional hardy tree silhouetted against the night. "We have to scramble down," I said. "We've no choice." "We'll break our necks down there," said Mike. "It's better than being eaten," I said. We began to try to carefully descend the scree, and it was right at that moment that all hell broke loose. At least 3 animals appeared at the top of the scree and leapt on us. I hit one a good blow in what passed for a face with the fire extinguisher, before losing hold of the extinguisher and watching it roll off down the scree, bouncing as it went. After that, everything was chaos. I felt pincer-like jaws take a good chunk out of my arm, and I heard Mike screaming like a lunatic. I couldn't properly see what was attacking us in the dark, but I caught a glimpse of horrible slimy mandibles and insectoid eyes, as well as furry wolf-like bodies covered in thick spines. I found myself running down the scree in great bounds, sometimes falling and rolling, but then finding my feet again miraculously and scrambling on down as fast as I could. About halfway down I tripped and came to a stop in front of some bushes that were clinging to the hillside. I stood up to find 3 sets of eyes surrounding me. I could make out their forms only dimly, but what I saw was enough to give me nightmares for the rest of my life. Their heads were clearly the heads of insects, like cockroaches or beetles of some kind, and their bodies hideously spiky, lupine forms. They approached me, opening and closing sharp mandibles with a terrible clicking sound. I don't know quite why, but in what I assumed to be my last moments on Earth, the weird, lilting melody of the music box came to me, and I began to whistle it to comfort myself. At that, the revolting beasts stopped waving their mandibles and seemed to freeze. Emboldened somewhat, I whistled more loudly, and they abruptly turned and ran off up the hill altogether. I had no idea what exactly had happened, but I seized the chance and began running down the scree again, tripping and bounding over the loose rocks. At the bottom I must have hit my head, because I don't remember how I wandered onto the road. The next thing I was fully aware of, an Italian couple were gazing at me anxiously in the half-light of dawn. I saw I was lying actually on the road, and Mike was nowhere to be seen. They took me to a hospital where I was given some stitches in my arm. I kept shouting at everyone that 2 or 3 of my friends had been killed, but they only assured me that the police were on their way. I could do nothing to help Mike if he was still alive out there. I felt as though they weren't taking me quite seriously and suspected I was mad. The doctors were puzzled by the bite. It had no teeth marks, and at first they thought I had been attacked with a knife, but I assured them an animal was responsible for the wound. I was extremely anxious to talk to the police and get them to launch a rescue, and eventually a policeman and woman turned up. I explained to them that there had been 4 of us and we had been attacked by hideous creatures. They promised to organise a rescue team to find Mike, but only an hour later, they brought Mike himself directly to me. I practically rolled all the way down the hill, he explained. Some tourists picked me up at the bottom. Geez, I thought you were dead. The police subsequently held a kind of inquiry and concluded we had been attacked by stray dogs. We tried to tell them that whatever attacked us, it was something weirder than dogs, but they weren't having it. A couple of strays were rounded up and euthanized, and that was that, as far as the police were concerned. They said the building we had found was nothing but a breeding facility for pigs and had recently closed down. It became pretty clear to Mike and I that something was being covered up, but what, I don't know. Several years later, we did hear rumours of American-funded research being performed in those hills. Supposedly, certain organisations fund research there that couldn't be done legally in the US, but that was just a rumour, and we couldn't get to the bottom of it. I don't know why my whistling repelled the beasts. My best guess is that the scientists who bred them trained them to respond to it. That would explain why the old man was still trying to wind a music box with the last of his resources. Funerals were held for Polly and Cooper back in the States. The art school also held a little memorial. Their families kicked up quite a fuss at first, but were somehow persuaded to give up their calls for further investigation. Neither was the matter widely reported in the news. You can only find a short mention of it in the Florence Gazette, which caters to English-speaking foreigners. Mike and I remain good friends. We must have spent hundreds of hours talking about what happened, but in the end, there is only so much to be said. Have other people been killed by those animals in Abruzzo, whatever they were? What was the purpose of the research if that's what it was? I guess we'll never know. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this story, please lock all the doors and windows and click the like and subscribe buttons. Thank you. My name's John and you've been listening to Science Horror. I think I'm going to go back to releasing new episodes on Monday because that seemed to get me more views. Until next time, sleep well.